Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Underrated Movie Podcast. This is a podcast that discusses films that are underrated, underappreciated, and ones that have slipped under the radar and passed most people by. Today, we're going to be talking about the 2015 Gothic romance directed and written by Guillermo del Toro, co-written by Matthew Robbins, Crimson Peak, starring Mia Wasikowska, Tom Hiddleston, and Jessica Chastain. Joining me to discuss this film is somebody who knows a bit about Gothic period piece type stuff and movies, of course, in general, and that would be Phil Isco. Phil is, of course, the host of podcasts like It's 1992. He is also the co-creator of the TV show Sleepy Hollow. How's it going, Phil? Thanks so much for being on.
It's good. Thank you so much for having me. I'm always excited to talk about this movie.
Yeah. So I'm very excited to talk about it as well. Before we get into it, what did you want to let people know about your podcast?
Yeah, I currently have a podcast with Emily St. James where we cover all the films of, or the majority of the films that is of 1992. It's been a lot of fun. We've 100 episodes plus now. The podcast will actually be evolving into something new later this summer, so stay tuned for that. But if you want to hear myself and Emily talk with people like Esty Haim and Sarah Pauly and Karina Longworth about all the great movies that came out in 1982, that's the place to check out.
Yeah, really, really great podcast. Have some great episodes on a really interesting year in film. But yeah, speaking of interesting films, of course, Crimson Peak is a very interesting one that went kind of under the radar. It's very underappreciated. I think, it's one that did okay critically, did not do well at the box office. I love your shirt, by the way. I'll just let anybody listening know that you have a shirt on that says Crimson Peak was good. And I was like, all right, you came prepared. You know what's up. So you sent, when we were first talking, you sent me a list of movies you'd potentially wanted to cover. Mm-hmm. And this is actually a movie I had wanted to cover for a long time too. So I was awesome. All right, let's go with Crimson Peak. Been on my long list. What was it about Crimson Peak that made you feel like it'd be a good movie to talk about on Underrated?
I think that there's obviously a bunch of stuff, and we'll get into all of it. But from sort of 30,000 feet, I think that it was a bit of a weird movie. It is a weird movie, and I think that it kind of came out. Guillermo del Toro's career is fascinating in and of itself, which is that he sort of has never really gotten a blank check in the way that a lot of people would sort of think. His movies, he's had a handful of successful films, but they're always kind of on the cusp of really breaking out. I think that, if you look at Guillermo's career and where this falls in it, it's sort of at a weird space in his career. Like he puts out Pacific Rim, which comes out in 2013, which was sort of kind of a hit. Like it spawned a sequel for what that's worth, but like that movie cost about $200 million to make. It makes a little over 400. So like, it's not as though it was a failure by any means. Mm-hmm. That was just, it made $200 million, but it is sort of, he kind of uses that to make this movie to some degree, right? Like Universal was kind of his home a bit. He does Hellboy 2 with them, which is another movie that sort of was this big like he's just one of these guys who clearly has these passion projects that are very expensive that people don't really know what to do with. And the studios kind of look at it and say, like, is this worth the money? Is this worth what ultimately could feel like a sort of love letter to a form of cinema that people don't necessarily care as much about as maybe they should, right? And this movie, Crimson Peak, is sort of marketed strangely. I don't think that Universal fully appreciated kind of what the movie really was. They kind of sold a bill of goods with the trailer, that it was more of a horror movie and more of a suspense movie. You know what I mean? Like it's really a Gothic romance, as you sort of said earlier. And I think their gut was, who gives a shit about Gothic romances? Let's just push this as a horror movie. And there's an argument to be made for then don't make the gothic romance. Like I always have the same feelings when movies come out and don't perform, not all
Mm,
that dissimilar to what just transpired this past weekend with Furiosa,
mm,
a movie that I loved. But you have to ask yourself, Warner Brothers, what do you what did you think was going to happen here? I mean, Fury Road finishes a distant second to Pitch Perfect 2 back in 2015. It makes money, but like it doesn't
yeah,
ever like really catch on in the way that I think that they thought it could. An
right.
R-rated weird ass movie that's like 2 hours and 20 minutes long. Like I'm just sort of like, so when the reason I bring up this in comparison to Crimson Peak is that I think that Crimson Peak had a similar fate, which is that
Mm,
Universal sort of pushed this as a movie that it wasn't really, right? Like
hmm
I can't I feel bad because I sat down in that theater also expecting a horror film, and I left the theater with my friends, and we all kind of shrugged because it wasn't what we expected it to be. And
Yeah.
in hindsight, every time I watch it, I'm just like, this movie's so good. I wish that we all could kind of have loved it for what it actually was, as opposed to what we were told to like it for.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. No, I think you're really right about this being pretty mismarketed because it was one of those movies that had a reputation, especially when it came out, of people being like, "Yeah, don't the trailers lied to us." You know, it's like one of those movies like Godzilla 2014 or something like that, where it's like you
Sure.
go in expecting one thing and you get a very different genre of movie. Like it's pretty much played like a straight up just kind of like horror film with like like a just typical haunted house movie
Yeah.
where today I was watching a lot of the behind the scenes featurettes and stuff because I have the Blu-ray for this, and Del Toro mentions he's like, yeah, this is a gothic romance. It's not a gothic horror, and he's like, there's a lot of connections, like there's a lot of similarities between gothic horror and gothic romance to the point where there is a lot of horror in gothic romance, like it's quintessential to the genre, but it's still its own thing. And so, it was one of those movies that I went in expecting one thing, I got something else that I ended up actually liking a lot more because
Yeah.
it does feel so unique, both in terms of like its genre and its plotting and the way it looks, because they went all out in making this movie. Like I
Mhm.
mean, obviously it does a lot of digital stuff, but it does what I think movies should do, which is do as much practically as possible, and then do the stuff that is impossible practically with the digital effects and stuff like that. And because the ghosts in this, the reason they look so good and scary is because they have that classic Del Toro creepy people stumbling around in these like creepy things, but then they'll be transparent or they'll be floating or whatever. And that extends to, I think, the set design. The color theory in this is spectacular. The way they use blues and reds, I think it's some of the best use of color in a modern film. And yeah, Del Toro, I think he's really just this fascinating figure. Like you said, he's somebody who has never really gotten a blank check, and he really, and like you brought up Furiosa, like George Miller, I think he's somebody who kind of walks the line between like a quote unquote auteur director and like somebody who's going to make a big box office smash. And I think that because of that, his movies, both their movies, can end up somewhere in the middle like this, where they get a pretty good budget, and the studios don't know how to market it. Do they market this like an art film, or do they market this like a big summer blockbuster? And I think that they ended up trying to market this like a big summer horror film, like a not necessarily like a Saw, but something kind of like that,
Mhm.
when it's really not at all. And for me personally, that's where my sensibilities lie. I love a movie that is not full on avant-garde weirdness, but it's also not going to be just your basic meat and potatoes simple story. And I like both of those movies, but for me the real sweet spot is finding somewhere existing in the middle and giving you a movie like this where it's not simple. It's not what you expect. You have characters, like the Tom Hiddleston character Thomas Sharp, who I think he's really fascinating because he's not a good dude, but he's also like a victim. Like he's very clearly, someone who has done these terrible things because of the trauma that he's been through. He's been, basically manipulated through his entire life by his sister, and the like weird twisted love story that happens between him and the Mia Wasikowska character, Edith. It's a weird romance that you wouldn't really see in anything else, and Del Toro truly is, I think, the master of the gothic horror on the big screen in a way that nobody else is really doing nowadays, you know?
No, 100%. I mean, I think that it's interesting. You know, Del Toro, who makes most of his films now in Toronto, or at least he shoots them there, which gives him a lot of latitude in terms of some of his overhead. So he can make them a little he can get more bang for his buck up in Toronto when it comes to production than he can down here. So Shape of Water, this film, I believe Nightmare Alley, a lot of his movies are shot up there. And you can tell that he's got a freedom. I mean, this movie cost $55 million, which is obviously not nothing. This movie looks phenomenal. I mean,
Yeah.
watching this again the other day and thinking about the fact that this film received zero Academy Award nominations for any of its production is pretty shocking. And I don't say that because the Academy is some fucking great um, group of people. You know, they've missed the mark on many, many occasions. But this movie is so luxurious in its production detail, which is usually a thing that the Academy acknowledges. The irony, of course, being that the film that got the nod in 2015 was The Danish Girl of all movies, which got production design and cinematography and costume design. Now, thankfully, speaking of Miller, Mad Max is what runs away with most of the production awards that year, and rightfully so. But I do think that this movie being overlooked for costumes and production design is a fucking crime, in my opinion. This movie is, as you just mentioned, so stunning to look at. The sort of main foyer set that they have of the house that has this giant hole in the ceiling that's there's snow always
Yeah.
sort of coming down is so haunting. The set in the basement with all of the clay wells that they have is also phenomenal. You mentioned the ghosts. I think the last time I was on here, I talked about the Frighteners, if I'm not mistaken. So
Yep.
there is
Yep.
a theme here of ghost stories, but I do think that one of the things that, and I've also watched the making of documentary on this. There's a lot of you mentioned sort of the tactility versus the CGI, and Guillermo del Toro is obviously a big wants to build things, right? If he can build it, he's going to build it. And the ghosts have this sort of their skeleton, if you will, is built, right? So what they're doing is they're essentially using CG to sort of augment and play off of that. So the wisps and the kind of the ghostliness of it are done through CG, where the actual sort of figures that are moving are built, and they're built of this sort of the scarlet clay, this red clay, this blood-like clay that emits from the ground of the aforementioned and titular Crimson Peak
Hmm.
is just so cool to look at because you really feel like you can touch it in a way that we still, despite, I mean, I've been fooled many times, I'm sure you have too, by CG effects as to what's real and what's not. But I still feel like we can tell when something is physically in the environment and when it's not. There's just some sort of a second sense that we have of that. And this movie really sort of takes that to the next level. So, I mean, I also just, I have to say too, rewatching it, I was thinking a lot of The Age of Innocence, the Scorsese film, which I
Hmm.
adore. And this really is sort of like Imagine Age of Innocence, but it's a fucking ghost story. And I really couldn't get over, it takes its time to get you to Crimson Peak. I mean, it takes about a half hour, 40 minutes to get there. And I
Yeah.
think that that's another reason why, I'm guessing anyway, this movie takes its time. This movie's not in a rush to do anything, and audiences have no fucking patience. So I think that part of it as well is like, why is this taking so long for me to be scared? Which is a bummer because I think that this movie's pacing is part of its beauty.
Yeah, I completely agree with pretty much everything you've said. And yeah, I think that this movie really is one of the best looking movies probably ever made. Like, it's just
So beautiful.
astounding how good this looks, you know? And like I said, $55 million is not nothing, but every one of those dollars is on the screen. Like this looks better than a lot
100%.
of movies that cost, 100, $200 million. And I kind of always bemoan the loss of those movies that are like we don't get a lot of those like weird, like they're not based on any IP movies that are made in like the 50 to $80 million range. Like I feel like those are becoming more and more rare, and we're either getting Jason Blum making a movie for $2 million, or we're getting DC or Marvel making a movie for 100. And like those movies are both great, but like you need a middle ground. And it's a shame that movies like this fail, but yeah, like this movie, it just looks so good, and it's because it's being made by a master. He's taking like the time, using every tool in the toolbox to just make it look phenomenal. And I love that too, that it does take its time to get to Crimson Peak, because it first like establishes like that base of like a more color, a kind of sepia tone, almost like modern quote unquote Buffalo, like America setting, where it's like almost rural, not rural, but like it's like it almost looks like a western kind of, with its like color, and you're getting all that. It's much more lively. And then you get to Crimson Peak, and it is just like these blacks and these very subtle blues, and then of course the red you mentioned, which is just like so striking, and it's like blood just seeping in through the walls. And when they first take that step and it creeps up through the floorboards, you're like, wow, okay, this is what we're in store for. But the other thing that you mentioned that I really wanted to kind of talk about a bit is, that this is a movie with ghosts in it. And I love that quote. Like, I love when a movie will kind of like subtly tell you, often, with a writer, and, we're both writers. So, I think we get this where they have the main character as a writer, and they're like, this is what my story is about. And you're like, okay, well, that's a clue for what this movie's going to be about. And I love that she says it's got a ghost in it, but it's not a ghost story. And I think that's like a
Yeah.
real Del Toro, like hanging a lantern, being like, that's what this movie is. And he has all these ghosts, which are, they're objectively like scary, horrific looking things, but in a way that only Del Toro can do. They're somehow also like beautiful and immaculate, and like really just amazing to behold in a way that, you don't see anyone else do. And these ghosts, which should be scary, are actually out here trying to help our heroes. And, ultimately, you see Tom Hiddleston transform into a ghost, and the ghost, which scares her at the beginning of her mom, is what gives her that ultimate warning. And I love that idea of like, yeah, this is a movie featuring ghosts, but it's not paranormal activity. It's not like run away from these scary monsters.
No, totally. I mean, I think you're kind of circling something that I think is a feature, not a bug, about Guillermo del Toro's career, and I would argue about other filmmakers, people like Tim Burton as well. People that like telling stories, like
Mm.
bold the word story, storytellers, fairy tales, this idea of eh, fables, this idea of the mythology of something, and stories that have been passed on from generation to generation. You can, and I think that a lot of people ding him, and by him I mean Guillermo del Toro, for being all style and no substance, right? Because they feel that for whatever reason, playing within the sandbox of genre or through pastiche and making sort of love letters to movies of yesteryear somehow isn't as substantive as
Mhm.
telling another story of some sort, which I think is foolish, but that's just a choice, right? I mean, it is no different than reading a fairy tale or something along those lines. And I think that this movie, and there's an argument to be made for a lot of the movies that Guillermo del Toro has made, of being not subtle. Fairy tales and fables
Yeah.
aren't subtle. Like they're
Yeah.
not supposed to be. They're parables, and they're trying to hit you over the head with their moral compass. That's the point of them. And I think part of it is just audiences being jaded. Part of it is just audiences not wanting to sort of allow things to just kind of exist in a vibe. But like this is a vibe movie. This is just like
Mm.
sit here and enjoy this beautiful canvas that I'm unfurling in front of you, and these fucked up relationships and what is love and why do we love who we love. I think that some of it is a little bumpy. I think that the relationship between Edith and Alan is a little bit sort of like, why doesn't she just want to be with him at the beginning, is a little bit baffling to me. But whatever. I guess maybe she's just not that into Charlie Hunnam until he comes to save her. I don't know. All that being said, I guess ultimately what I'm getting is I think that the Charlie Hunnam casting is maybe a little bit off. He's like this big, brooding, gorgeous man.
That's the one thing in the movie that I ding a little bit is the Charlie Hunnam of it all.
He's not bad as an actor, just to be clear. I think he's just miscast in the sense of like, why would a woman not want to run away with Charlie Hunnam? Like, it's just sort of like, I don't really get it. But I do think that, and you sort of were circling this earlier, and I think you're absolutely right that the Thomas Sharp character played by Tom Hiddleston is so tragic, and you sense this deep sort of well of sadness for the things that he's done, all in sort of this attempt to sort of chase money and placate his puppet master sister. You know, I think about when he comes in and his entrance for the first time makes him look like a ghost because of the blown out city street behind him. I love the way that Del Toro uses when you're, and I'm sure that you and your audience knows this, but you know, whenever you're dealing with blue screens or any sort of CG background, you'll get halo effects around people because they're separated from the background, because the background is not real. It is a computer generated image. And very infrequently is the money spent to make that separation not as distinct. It's just very expensive to do. So what he does in this movie is he blows all that out so that when they're outside and they're in that kind of weird haze of white snow and whatever's going on outside, when they have sort of their big fight scene between her and Jessica Chastain, that blown outness makes everything look ethereal rather than making it look cheap. And I think that it's understanding how to use effects for you rather than against you, I think is something that obviously Guillermo's very good at, but it adds to this whole sort of je ne sais quoi of this movie, of this intangible kind of dreamlike nightmare kind of world that he's created. I don't know. I mean, I get why this isn't for some people. I think that if this movie, I get why you released this at around Halloween. Like, I get it. It's a haunted house movie. But I'm also like, if you would release this in December or even in November, I think you might have had a better chance of not sort of and pitched it more as like a period drama, gothic romance, and maybe even tried to kind of go for those production Oscars. They might have been able to do better, but maybe I'm wrong. Maybe they made that, you know, the 75 million they made might have been because it came out at Halloween. Fuck, I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. They're probably going up against some Conjuring movie or something like that. Like
probably, who knows?
But yeah, I think that's all really really well said, and yeah, I think that this movie it's a really interesting kind of nexus point, I think, in Del Toro's career, because, like you said, he doesn't get any nominations at the Oscars, and you know, this movie, like we said, comes out after Pacific Rim, which is probably his, maybe other than Hellboy, his most commercially successful
probably
big movie.
I'm trying to think of what Blade 2 might have done, but yeah, I mean, I think you're probably right. Yeah.
And you know, now, like, I feel like he's you know, once again fallen into this weird middle place where he's a guy who gets Oscar nominations and even wins, you know, like we saw with Shape of Water. And I feel like he's so weirdly in the middle where it's like people are like mad at those movies for getting Oscar nominations. Like, I feel like I've heard a lot. There's like a lot of a lot of Best Picture winners get backlash, but like I feel like Shape of Water, which is a movie I really like, and I also really like Nightmare Alley, they both have gotten a ton of backlash. But I think that by making this, like, maybe the Academy and their ilk started to realize, like, okay, maybe this guy is more than just a guy who because he'd obviously like made ethereal heady stuff, but it was mostly in Spanish, you know, or like, you know, smaller stuff. And this kind of, I think, was maybe his announcement that, like, yeah, I can do like a weird movie that is going to be prestigey and get some attention of the awards voters.
I mean, it should be said the guy's got 3 Academy Awards now. Like it's, I mean, actually 4. I mean,
Mm.
he won for Pan's Labyrinth, he won 2 for Shape of Water, and he won for Pinocchio last year. Uh,
Right, right.
so the guy's no slouch, right? Like it's
Yeah,
not as
no.
though I wasn't suggesting you were saying that. I think that to your point, and to sort of piggyback on it, I think that Shape of Water comes out in 2017, which was a really, really good year for movies.
Mm.
Get Out, Lady Bird, Phantom Thread. I mean, it was a banger year, and
Yeah.
I think that everyone kind of looks at that movie and says, on top of the fact that like there are just people that are probably just not into a mute lady fucking a fish man. That's fine. And that's your prerogative.
Yeah.
But to say that the Academy played it safe by giving that an Academy
Right.
Award is crazy. But it is a movie that people kind of, it's a divisive movie.
Hmm.
And I think it's divisive because people look at what came out that year and we're sort of like, this was the movie that you got behind. That being said, he then gets probably the closest thing he's had to a full blank check in Nightmare Alley. Searchlight gives him the most money they've ever given to a budget of a film before, which I
Hmm.
believe was upwards of $50 or $60 million, which was a lot.
Yeah.
And that movie doesn't perform because it comes out in 2021, which was a weird year, as we all know, in terms of post-COVID, and there were
Hmm.
various other, what's the word, I'm like, versions of COVID that came out and affected the
Right.
box office in the tail end of that year. So that movie just doesn't perform for a whole bunch of reasons. And then
Including,
he
I
makes,
should say that they should
yeah,
have put it out in black and white, and they didn't. But that's a whole other diatribe I can go on.
I mean, I never saw it in black and white. I believe that I bought it on iTunes, and I believe it has both versions on there, so I
Okay.
can see. I have not watched it in black and white. I mean, I think it looked really beautiful in color too, just to be clear. But I know
It
what you're
looked
saying.
great,
Yeah,
but yeah,
yeah.
it's one of those things that went from like a 4.5 star to a 5 star movie when I saw it in black and white.
That's fair. I mean, I think Nightmare Alley ultimately was probably a little too long for its own good.
Mm.
I think that Bradley Cooper, I would argue, I'm not sure that he gets people in seats in the same way that perhaps somebody else might have. As
Mm.
much as I actually think it's one of his best performances, quite honestly. I think he's
Yeah.
tremendous in the movie. I think ultimately it just didn't really perform.
Mm.
And then Netflix lets him make Pinocchio, and now he's making Frankenstein for Netflix. There is an argument now that I'm wondering if like he's just kind of, if he's become sort of like Fincher over there, where Netflix is just going to kind of let him do whatever he wants to do, and
Hmm.
they don't want any pushback, and they don't apparently care about having their movies released in theaters to the same degree, and that's their choice, I guess. But he does exist in a weird kind of nether zone of his movies
Yeah.
are really expensive. They don't always hit with audiences. They don't always hit with critics. It's just kind of this weird in between space. And I think this movie, Crimson Peak, is, I would argue, maybe the most glaring example of him being like, I'm going to do this thing that I want to do, and maybe people will show up and see it. Like I don't know.
Right.
It's kind of strange.
Yeah. Yeah. It feels like, yeah, he's like you said, he never gets a full blank check, but they did still let him build like an entire ruin, because like he wasn't like, I'm not gonna go shoot somewhere, I'm gonna make this crazy building that would never exist in real life, that has a
Crazy.
hole in it, and these teeth hallways, and just like crazy vats and stuff like that. So
Yeah,
like, yeah,
yeah.
he's still, like, this is like through and through. Like, I watching this, I'm like, this is some Del Toro ass shit for sure.
And it's an incestual love story at its heart
Yeah.
too.
Yeah, like that part is just like, you're just like, oh, it's one of those things you're like, are they gonna really do it? And then they do it, and you're like, okay, wow.
Yeah. It's also kind of a moment too where like Tom Hiddleston, Jessica Chastain, Mia Wasikowska are all kind of people that people know by their
Mhm.
faces, but I'm not entirely convinced know who they are by their names at this
Right.
stage in their careers. Like I know that, I mean, Jessica Chastain has done at this point Zero Dark 30,
Hmm.
but like Tom Hiddleston's Loki. So
Right.
like no one knows him as anyone other than Loki.
Hmm.
Mia's been in a million things, but like no one knows who her name is.
Right. Right. No,
And
I
it's
agree.
like, and I believe, and both of them, Tom Hiddleston and Mia, are both in Only Lovers Left Alive, which I believe is is it that year or the year after? It's like right around that time.
It's I want to say
Um,
2016, but I might be wrong.
no, I'm sure. Let's see. I'm just looking it up real quick here. Yeah, I mean, I think that
Oh, 2013.
2013. Okay, so they'd previously done this movie together.
No.
It's just interesting. I mean, Hiddleston's a guy who I actually really thought was going to have a bigger career than he did, and I
Hmm.
mean, it's not over, but like, I don't. It just I don't feel like he ever fully popped as anything outside of Loki
Hmm.
for people. Jessica Chastain should have got an Oscar nomination for this performance. I think she's so
Yeah.
insanely creepy and fully understands what movie she's in.
Yes, yes. She understands the assignment. I think yeah, it's such a weird, like you said, bizarre love story with like the incest and like, I love that like how angry she gets when she finds out that like they actually had sex because,
Yes.
he's been duping all these people and poisoning them, but she's like, "Oh, it's just, to get to dupe these heiresses out of their money or whatever." And then she realizes like, "Oh no, he actually has feelings for Edith." And
Mhm.
she like has that crazy scene in the kitchen. Who, by the way, aside, but there's this moment in the behind the scenes features I'm sure you saw, but like I'm letting anybody else out there know, where Del Toro describes one of the biggest horrors in this movies as her cooking, and he's like, yeah, she's probably not a great cook, and it's like turn of the century like English cooking. It's probably not great, but yeah, that scene's so just incredible and powerful. And yeah, I think that you talked about Tom Hiddleston, like people know him as Loki. He's been in some stuff. Jessica Chastain, people know her a little bit. The one I'm really surprised by is Mia, because I feel like there was she had been Alice in Wonderland. I feel like there had been a moment when we're like, oh, is she going to just become
Mhm.
like a movie star?
Yes.
And you're like waiting for her to like really break out. I had been a fan of her since she was in Defiance in 2009. I thought she was really
Mhm.
great in that movie. Probably I'll cover it at some point on this podcast. And then like I said, Alice comes out, and you're like, okay, cool. She's announced herself. But what ends up being
Yeah.
coming out of that movie is not she's not the movie star. The star is live action Disney remakes. That becomes a thing that
Yeah.
for whatever reason pops out of that movie. And that's a movie I don't have a lot of fondness for, but I think she's really good in it. And then and then she's in stuff like you said, she still shows up and stuff. But this is like her last role that I think is at least
Yeah,
pretty
it's
well seen and recognized.
well, so Alice in Wonderland and The Kids Were All Right are both in 2010, and I feel like
Hmm.
to your point, that's kind of an announcement of like, who is this, and she's gonna be in a bunch of stuff. She's in the
Right.
Fukunaga Jane Eyre with Michael Fassbender, which
Yeah.
is fine. Um, I don't love that movie, but some people really do. I love. She's
It's
great in
fine.
Stoker, the Park Chan Wook film, with again a movie that no one saw. And then Only Lovers Left Alive, and then like I think ultimately, and listen, I could be totally wrong here, but I do wonder whether or not she kind of. It's almost like she wanted to have Kristen Stewart's career
Hmm.
too quickly, right? It was almost as though, like, Kristen Stewart, say what you will, and Pattinson as well, right? Both of them are the first two to like really leverage enormous franchise success into helping auteur weird filmmakers get their movies made, right? Which is
Hmm.
now their modus operandi, and God bless them for it.
Hmm.
But I feel like Mia perhaps rightly wrongly felt like Alice was like, okay, I'm good to go. I can go do a whole bunch of weird shit now, and like never came back to shore. Like never did
Right.
the one for them, one for me, one for them, one for me. She just was like, they're all for me now, and no one went to see them, which is just interesting. And I do think Crimson Peak, to your point, is the biggest studio movie she makes after Alice,
Hmm.
and that's 5 years later.
Right.
And then she does the Alice sequel, which was a notorious financial
Huge
boondoggle.
bum. Like, and I wonder, did that like hurt her career? Because like, it's not her
It might
fault.
have.
That movie's just awful. Like, she
Yeah.
didn't have anything to do with it. But yeah, that movie just tanked.
Yeah. And then there's Bergman Island, which I had yet to see and people love, and it's been on my queue to watch for a long time. So, but all of this is to say, your assessment, I think, like everybody, when Mia kind of came on the scene, was like, oh, new young movie star. She's going to
Yeah.
be in everything and we're going to love her. And then It just didn't seem to manifest.
Yeah, it's weird because like I looked up and I was like, she makes this movie when she's like 25. She's like the same age as me. I think she's born like a month after. So like now she's like in her mid 30s, and like she really kind of just vanished.
Yeah.
It's crazy. It's a bummer.
My guess is
Yeah,
that my assumption is that she's fine
yeah, I'm
financially.
sure she's doing okay. Yeah,
I don't think that we need to worry about
yeah,
her per se, and that she kind of pops up here and there when she reads a script. And my guess is that her reps are constantly sending her stuff, and every now and then she reads a thing that she likes, and she's like, "Yeah, I'll do that."
yeah,
But to your point, these three leads in 2015 make total sense in the way of they're not crazy expensive.
hmm
They're people that people know. They're on the cusp of being something huge, which is always what you want, right? Where you're just like, if I get on the right track with these three people at the right moment, my movie could just be gigantic. But then all
right.
three of these people just never take off in the way that you expect, and instead you're left with three great actors in a great movie that kind of no one really saw the same
Yeah,
to the
it's
way they should
yeah.
have. Yeah.
Yeah, it's almost like, not exactly the same because Anya Taylor-Joy's having a much bigger career, but like it's, once again, like parallels with Furiosa, where you've got a star from Thor, you've got this, young ingenue, like star whose career seems to be really having a lot of trajectory.
No, I think the Anya Taylor Joy comparison and the Furiosa comparison across the board in a lot of ways is an
mhm,
apt one. I think that Anya, you know, I feel bad because there's just so much Monday morning quarterbacking going on with Furiosa, and
mhm.
it doesn't seem particularly fair in my
Yeah,
opinion. I think everyone knew that this year was going to be thin because of the strike in terms of how many movies were coming out and movies being sort of put into tentpole position that probably wouldn't be in a different year.
hmm
And I think that Warner Brothers thought that Furiosa was going to be their Memorial Day
yeah,
flag in the ground,
right.
and it wasn't. I don't think it's Anya's fault, and I think Anya's going to be in Dune 3 anyway, so she'll be fine.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah.
I'm not too worried about her.
Yeah, and like this summer has just been so weird because it's like sure, like technically Furiosa vastly underperforming. It's somehow still though the first ever Mad Max movie to be number one at the box office. Like,
Correct.
and I think this is kind of just speaking to the place maybe theaters are at. Like, other than Apes, I think that pretty much all the big tent pole blockbusters as of recording have really underperformed.
I mean, Dune 2 did very, very well. And I think
Yeah.
that if
Well, that was like early. That was like
that
last,
was in
like end
March,
of
that was
last
in
year.
March.
Oh, it was in March. Okay, so I guess I'm just
Yeah.
saying summer movies then.
Yeah, no, which is fair. Yeah, I mean, Dune did very well. I think that Warner Brothers was smart in placing it in March, where it
Mhm.
really kind of had the run of
Right,
a
which
good
I
chunk
thought
of
was
time,
at the time I
which
thought
was
that was
smart.
dumb, but they're smarter than I am apparently. That was brilliant.
I think it was smart. I think that hindsight being what it is, I think they really just put all their chips on Furiosa in a way that was probably proven
Mhm.
to be not the smart play. I would argue, I think that when everything is said and done and this film is finished its run, my guess is this movie will make somewhere around what Fury Road did, which by the way,
Yeah.
only made like 330 or 340 million dollars worldwide, right? I think that
Mhm.
Furiosa is going to probably get within striking distance of that, probably a little bit less, but still. So I don't ultimately think that it's going to be this, gigantic mistake. We'll
Mhm.
see.
Yeah.
But to your point, it's been a weird summer. It's been a weird year in terms of the releasing of things. But, in 2015, when Crimson Peak comes out, there's kind of no excuse for it to not perform. And again, it should be said, this movie still made $20 million. That's not what they wanted. Obviously, they
Yeah.
invested a lot more into it and they wanted to make more back. But I just it is interesting what we consider to be bombs nowadays.
Right.
And even back in 2015, what was considered a bomb, it's just like maybe don't spend so much money on these movies.
Yeah. Like that's the thing, like last year I think a lot of the movies that came out and they're like Indiana Jones 5, which it's a movie I go to bat for, but like a movie that did not need to cost $300 million. Like that, and it's a movie that like by Indiana Jones standards didn't make a lot of money, by blockbuster standards made a lot of money, but not enough to justify that absolutely humongous price tag. So I think
I
yeah,
mean, that
it's
was, yeah. It's funny. I saw that movie opening weekend with friends. I thought it was fine. Like I
Mm,
didn't hate it. I didn't love it. I don't really have much of an impetus to watch it again anytime soon. My assumption is that all of that de-aging stuff that they did up top was just colossally expensive to do,
right. Yeah. Yeah.
and it just they shouldn't have done it. I don't know. Like, just don't
Yeah.
do it. But you know, it's funny. The other day, I discovered something that I don't think I even knew, quite honestly, which was that Jurassic World Forbidden, or what was
Oh.
it,
Oh.
Fallen
The
Kingdom or
second one.
whatever?
Yeah. Yeah. Fallen
Yeah,
Kingdom.
which I quite like and actually think is certainly the best of the most recent trilogy. Cost It's like the second most expensive movie in the history of Hollywood. Now
Mm.
it cost like $452 million, and it made like 1.2 billion. So like no one obviously cares. But I'm just like, how the fuck did you spend $450 million on the
Yeah.
second Jurassic World movie?
Yeah.
Okay,
I always think of the fourth Pirates of the Caribbean movie, which like
sure,
you watching like the second and third, I'm like, okay, I get why these are some of the most expensive movies ever made. It's all up there on like the Davy Jones and like the crazy set pieces, like
yeah, sure.
all the yeah. And then the fourth one, it just kind of looks like the first one again. Like it looks good, but it doesn't look as good as two or three, or certainly Crimson Peak. And I'm like,
Mhm.
how did you spend? It was like what, 400 million, $500 million. I'm like, it just like you don't need to spend. Some of that is like, they're giving Johnny Depp $50 million or whatever it is, but some of it's just like you don't need to spend this insane amount of money on these
No,
crazy franchise films.
I don't. I mean, I was talking to my roommate about this the other day, who's a studio executive in television development, and and I do think it's different with TV than movies, but I'm just going to say this anyway.
Mm,
I don't really believe that audiences are as aware of production value as we think they are. I
right.
think that there's a sort of a baseline, right?
Mm,
Where you have to meet that baseline. And if you're below that baseline, your audience is gonna be like, this looks like fucking garbage. I don't want to ever see this again, right?
yeah.
But once you grossly exceed that baseline, I just honestly don't know that they're even noticing a difference. Like
Hmm.
it to me just feels like directors wanting to have all of this money because they want their movies, to their eyes, to look just extraordinary, which isn't necessarily an unreasonable ask. But like, bring it back to this movie. This movie cost $55 million. Not not a lot of money, but it's also not $450 million. And you just and this movie looks fucking exquisite. So like, I don't. There's a disconnect going on, I think, between what directors think that audiences' expectations are for special effects and production, and what they really are. And I just don't think that they're nearly as high as these filmmakers think they are.
Yeah, honestly, I really agree with all of that. I think that you can really make something look phenomenal for a lot of money, but not a lot of money compared to these insane budgets that these films are going, like these they're just going out of control and stuff like that. Because I think everyone thinks they have a Top Gun Maverick and
Mhm.
they're going to make that amount of money back, so it justifies this crazy spending. And that those your Top Gun Mavericks, your Barbies come around once a year. Not every
For
studio is going to
sure.
have that. Yeah.
And to be very clear to your listeners, I know that when a movie's budget is $400 million, that probably a third of that is actual production costs, right? Everything, there's any number of, you've got your fucking reshoots, you have
Mhm.
your P&A budget for, for marketing and all that sort of stuff. Like, I don't mean to suggest that it's just special effects and production design that people are spending money on. Obviously, that's not the case. But there's just a whole bunch of, let's just say, fucking weird ass bookkeeping going on with some of these
Yeah.
movies. And I know you have movie stars that are demanding, crazy trailers and any number of, like, there's all kinds of things that add up. I
Mhm.
don't mean to suggest otherwise, but I think that we as an industry, especially if we're going to keep theaters alive and getting people to movies, the way to get people back to movies is to bring the costs down. It's to make it
Mhm.
cheaper to go see movies. And the more expensive movies get, the more they're going to need to inflate prices, which is going to make them even more alienating to people. It's not smart.
Yeah, and just it's interesting just how the economics, I think, of movies have changed so much. Now it's like very obviously box office focused, where in the past you had DVD sales, but now you have VOD is a big thing, and streaming, and they how I think something that is very short-sighted that studios are doing is just like moving up these VOD dates. Like the Fall Guy, as we're recording this, is already out on VOD like 3 weeks after it came out in theaters, and it's just like you're cutting yourself off at the knees because you could have, you could do have what Disney had with Elemental, which is a movie that came out, looked like an absolute disaster, and it had legs. It wasn't a certified success after that, but it ended up being okay because Disney kept it in theaters. It ended up being a very like word of mouth, built up a lot, and people went and saw it. So I know it's weird, it's complicated.
No, I totally agree with you. I think Fall Guy is another perfect example. If any of your listeners follow Bilge Ebiri, who's an amazing critic at Vulture, he's been talking a lot about this movie, not just because he really loves it, which is fair because I think it's a great movie too, but just how it was showing legs. It's still showing legs even with it being released on VOD, which just goes to show that Universal is just panicked about it because they spent a lot of money on it and they expected it to be a bigger hit and they expected it to be the movie to open the summer, box office, and it didn't do so. But to your point, there's this weird sort of gut reaction that like, well, if we don't put it on VOD right now, then people are either not going to want to see it 6 weeks from now or 2 months from now on VOD, which of course they would. They're just as likely to watch it on VOD 2 months from now as they are to watch it now. So it doesn't change anything. It's just it's a really frustrating situation, and movie chains are struggling as well, just in terms of the movie theaters themselves suck, from what I hear. If you step outside your major metropolitan cities, it apparently gets very grim very fast, and ticket prices are very expensive. It's just tough.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of metrics and a lot of things that have to get fixed in order to get people back into movie theaters. But I'm cautiously optimistic because I think that movie stars, I mean, look at Challengers, look at Dune. If you look at these young actors that are up and coming right now that are very much pulling people into movie theaters, I think that that's a great sign of things to come, even if Anya might not necessarily be one of them yet. I do think that, yeah, I mean, I think that you have to you've got to approach all this with cautious optimism. And I have to say, on the Guillermo del Toro side of things, I understand Netflix said go make your Frankenstein movie, and he's excited to do that, and as he should be. That's a movie I'd like to see on the big screen. It's not a movie that I want to see on my computer screen, but
No, I get it, because Netflix is kind of trying to kill the theatrical experience, and it's just one of the things. I'm just like, just release them in theaters. Like release them in theaters for more than the like 1 week or whatever that you put out Glass Onion. They're just leaving money on the table. Like I get it. You want to like have your streaming service, but like just release these things too. Like, and even though we were talking about like we don't like the abbreviated release schedule, if you're already only releasing it on Netflix, put it in theaters too, and do both. I don't know.
Well, I mean, this is not to get too in the weeds on this, but I'll just say this for what it's worth, just because it's, for educational purposes. But a lot of this has to do with guilds. One of the frustrating things about Netflix is they only release their films for the bare amount that the guild will allow them without charging them more. So if they were to release any of their movies for, I think if it exceeds 2 weeks, then all of a sudden they have to pay the actors a lot more, part of that guild. So they're really just basically saying, well, if you really want to see it, here's 2 weeks, and then go fuck yourself.
Right.
And it's a bummer. I mean, I listen, I was lucky enough to see Glass Onion at TIFF, and then I saw it again in theaters during its run. I was, living in Los Angeles with Netflix having the Egyptian, I was able to see Hitman in theaters, but like, this should be the norm. Is Netflix interested in making movies or not? Or are they just interested in being an agent of chaos? And I don't think that they have an answer to that. So.
Right. Yeah. And I have such complex feelings about Netflix because, everything you said is true, but they're also like one of the few games in town that are giving Finchers and Del Toro's, like they're letting these guys make their movies. So I have so, it's so, I don't know. I have a lot of mixed emotions when it comes to them.
No, I'm right there with you. I will say this though, and I think it's worth noting. Fincher and Del Toro are two very persnickety filmmakers. Let's just say that, right?
Yeah.
Their expectations are very high. Their movies are very expensive, and there's a lot of, if you won't let me do what I want to do, fuck you. I'm taking my toys and I'm going somewhere else. Right? Like that
Right.
is their modus
Mhm.
operandi, and they're entitled to that. But there are obviously consequences to those actions. And I
Mhm.
do think that David Fincher and Guillermo del Toro could get movies made within the studio system. It would just require them to perhaps have more restrictions on the things that they want to do, and they don't want those restrictions. That's their choice, that's their prerogative. But sometimes I ask myself, what is more important to you? Your
Mhm.
ego or feeding this art form that you love so much? And I don't think that getting in bed with Netflix is feeding the art form. It's feeding your ego and letting you do what you
Yeah.
want to do. That's a bummer.
Yeah, no, I think that's really well put. But yeah, before I think that's a good place to put a pin in it. Before I get you out of here, though, I wanted to ask
Mhm.
you a
Yeah,
question because obviously this is a
absolutely.
movie about ghost stories, and
Yeah.
Del Toro talked about how being like there's the reason that ghosts show up in these corridors is because he talks about when he was a kid he would go get like a glass of water and he'd run back to bed real quick because he would you see something out of the corner of your eye, you think there's a ghost. Do you have any good ghost stories that happen to you or somebody or anything that you wanted to,
That's a good
to put out
question.
there?
So I don't know that I have any personally that
Mm.
jump to mind, but I have friends that have had situations for
Mm.
sure. I have two friends who are married, and one of them one of them believes in ghosts and one of them doesn't.
Okay.
And the one that believes in ghosts woke up one night to see her husband acting very strangely and was convinced that he was possessed.
Mm.
Not necessarily knows. Hard to say whether it was a possession per se, but she did buy this painting that she was convinced was haunted. And
A Ghostbusters 2 situation.
yeah, no, very, very, very similar. So I do think, I mean, you're sort of asking the question of like, do I believe in ghosts? Do I believe in an afterlife? I mean, there's that old thing about how we are energy and that energy can't
Mm.
technically die. It just moves from one thing to another. And my brain does, that seems the most logical to me. It has sort of
Mm.
an air of spiritualism to it. It has kind of this idea of, I don't know that necessarily I believe in souls or consciousness moving from one thing to another. I don't know that that seems plausible. I guess it's anything's possible, but I kind of believe in, this might constitute a ghost story, so
Okay.
I'll say this for what it's worth. I remember vividly years and years ago. I think I was probably like 12 or 13, I want to say, something like that.
Mm.
And I had a dream that I met my namesake, who was my grandmother's sister. Her name was Phyllis.
Oh.
She died before I was born. And I remember, I still to this day, like right now, can visualize the dream and visualize meeting her and remember waking up and it really feeling as though it was like this communion of some sort of that something transpired. I can't really explain it obviously, but that there was something going on there, that it was
Mm.
like her way of contacting me or something. It was
Right.
and again, I don't know what any of it really means. I don't really know why it happened. It could have very well had just been a very vivid dream that just for whatever reason my subconscious wanted me to have this. Who knows? But something's going on. There's something going on.
Yeah.
I don't know what it is. There's other layers of this world and consciousnesses and things that are unexplainable. Yeah, I don't know. I don't have an answer for you. Do you have a ghost story?
I do. Not once again one that happened to me because I don't necessarily really believe in ghosts, but I do think I really kind of want to, like
Sure,
like
sure,
if a ghost is listening to this podcast, please spook me tonight, like
sure.
I would love that. But yeah, I do think there are things in this world we don't understand and anything is possible. But so this is like some family lore that I really just recently found out within the last couple
Okay.
months. And watching Crimson Peak, I was reminded of it. Is that my grandma, who she was like died a few years back? She was like in her 90s, so she was born like 1912 or something like that. So,
Hmm.
very old timey lady. She, was very close with her grandma, who was, obviously, so she had been born in like the 1850s or 40s or something like that
Hmm.
in like Holland. So it was this little old Dutch lady called her Little Grandma A. And apparently,
Okay.
my mom told me this story. She's like, I guess my Grandma Lois, was going through some like hard times or something, and she went into, ironically, the kitchen where so much of this movie is set, and she was just kind of like feeling sad. And she said she saw Little Grandma A standing there as a specter, and much like Edith, in this movie, when she saw her mom, saw this thing, got spooked, ran out, and just like was like, oh, and then later on she was like, oh, Grandma A was trying to comfort me, trying to let me know that like you're going through something right now, but you're gonna be okay. And I like just when I found that I was like, wow, Grandma saw a ghost. That's pretty cool. So
Grandma saw a ghost. It's pretty cool. Yeah. Yeah.
yep, yep. Well, Phil, thank you so much for coming on. This has been a blast. So glad we got to talk about this movie. What did you want to let people know about the podcast, like it's, and anything else you've got going on?
I'll just say one last thing, just to
Yeah, absolutely.
about the movie that I think is worth. We talked about sort of the Jessica Chastain character, the Lucille character, and I do think that the depiction of mental health I thought was really interesting. Of just
Mm,
sort of, again, this kind of old timey institutionalizing people all the time craziness that existed back then.
mhm,
But I do think that Lucille is this sort of also very kind of tender, broken, sad character. I mean, some of her scenes, this in particular, the scene with the porridge and the way that she uses the noise she makes with the spoon
mhm,
around the edge of the bowl, and just this, there's this inherent kind of uneasiness that she brings to it. Jessica Chastain, who I do think as an actor, really, she could play good and evil incredibly
mhm,
well. Her range is phenomenal. I also just want to say, like, some of these action scenes are incredible. The push when she pushes Edith off of the balcony, and that shot of her falling off the balcony
mhm,
onto that pile of snow. There's just sort of this really kind of, obviously Del Toro is such a visceral filmmaker, and this movie doesn't have fight scenes per se, but when it is kind of dialed up, if it's the father's face getting just absolutely brutalized on that sink, whatever it is, like Del Toro, or just even him getting stabbed in the face
mhm.
when she stabs Thomas in the face, there is just this very kind of visceral body horror that he injects into this gothic romance that I think is just so beautifully gothically weirdly his. So I wanted to say that, and I also just want to say too, like, there's a great line that Lucille has where she says, basically Edith confronts her and says, like, why did you do all these horrors? And she's like, the horror was for love. And I think that
Mm,
that is Del Toro, right? Like,
right.
one line
Mhm.
encapsulates his entire oeuvre, which is just his, the horror is for love. He just loves all of that. It's
Yeah.
this kind of overly passionate human being. But yeah, so that's all I gotta say. But
Yeah.
in terms of where people can listen to me,
Well,
or
real
if you
fast,
have
real
to
fast. I
listen,
wanted to
yeah,
say
yeah, yeah,
something on that because you sparked something to me too.
yeah,
Is
sure, of
that
course,
one of the things Del Toro said about this was the horror was for love, is Tim talking about how this is a ghost story and it's like a horror movie, but he's like the real horror comes from the human heart. Like I thought that was
yeah,
so
yeah,
poignant, and there's
it's
so much
true.
good, right? Yeah, and there's so much great imagery that happens with these characters. And obviously they're kind of Edith is kind of like this beautiful young butterfly, and Jessica Chastain is like this dark evil moth who I love, by the way, that I always thought it was interesting, like, oh yeah, the moths are like these ugly. I'm like, Jessica Chastain is like one of the most attractive people on the planet. Like, it's weird that they're comparing her to an ugly moth, but in
Yeah,
the behind the scenes, Jessica Chastain says she doesn't think she's beautiful. So I thought that was like, okay, obviously
that's
we know
interesting.
just like this character is really beautiful, but in her mind she's an ugly moth, and I
Yeah,
thought that was an important distinction.
I think that I think also the movie is not subtle in its pitch black hair on
Mhm.
Lucille and its golden blonde locks on Edith.
Right.
There is sort of this yin and yang thing going
Mhm.
on, and sort of the darkness and the light, which I think is playing into sort of Lucille's notions of herself for sure.
Yeah. And she'll sit in like a big chair that looks like a butterfly. It's like, all right, I see what you're doing here.
It's not, again, not subtle.
Not subtle, but effective, I think.
Great. Yeah, I love it. Yeah.
But yeah, so go ahead. Let us know.
Yeah, no, I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah.
if people can check out podcasts like It's 1992 anywhere that they listen to their podcasts. You can also check out our Patreon podcast like it's double features, where I compare and contrast two movies, TV episodes, or albums with various wonderful guests. People can check that out at www.patreon.com/podcast like it's. And like I mentioned, all of this will be evolving into something very exciting come August. But in the meantime, check us out there.
Yeah, so that's just in 2 weeks from when this episode is dropping.
There you
So
go.
just around the corner.
Yep.
And yeah, I'll say to anybody listening out there, yes, if you're listening for the first time because you're a fan of Phil's, welcome, thank you. There's a bunch more episodes, just Underrated Movie Podcast on all the apps, and we're on all the social medias as Underrated Movie Podcast. We also have a Patreon, patreon.com/Underrated Movie Podcast. It's called Underrated Disc 2, where I do episodes on once a month. We'll talk about sports film, and that podcast is called Underdogs. I also do another bonus podcast whenever there's a new Marvel thing called Infinity Stones and Dragon Bones. And every other week when I don't do this podcast, I am a co-host on another podcast called Midnight Film Society that's just about the kind of just recent releases, just kind of a more conversational, what have we been watching type podcast. And then, so since this is coming out in July, I will let anybody know that in just a little over a week, if you are going to Comic-Con, I'd love to see you guys out there. I have a panel called Why Films Go Under the Radar that I'll be hosting with a bunch of great guests, a lot of people who have been on this show in the past. That's going to be the first day of Comic-Con, the 25th, over in the podcast pavilion, the Neil Morgan Auditorium at 4 o'clock. So if you're at Comic-Con, love for you to stop by and check that panel out. It's going to be a lot of fun. The Neil Morgan Auditorium, definitely check that out. Check out all that other stuff. And of course, check Phil out on all his stuff. But yeah, one more time, man, thanks for coming on and dissected this one with me.
Absolutely. It was an absolute pleasure. I hope to come back again sometime.
Yeah, we'll definitely have you on.